They say some houses don't stay empty, they wait. Ethan Cole heard that line once from an old army buddy, but he never believed it until the letter arrived on a cold Vermont morning. It was short, formal, and impossible to explain. He had inherited a ruin on the edge of Lake Hartwell Ridge. No memories attached. No clear reason why his name was written on it at all. Just a location, coordinates, and a key wrapped in faded cloth. Ranger, his German shepherd, stood beside him the moment envelope hit the table, ears slightly tilted as if he understood something Ethan did not. The drive took 4 hours through back roads where winter trees leaned over the asphalt like silent witnesses. When the house came into view, it looked less like property and more like something abandoned by time itself. Boards warped, windows clouded, walls breathing with age. Ethan stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into frozen dirt, while Ranger moved ahead without hesitation, nose low, tracking something unseen. Then it happened. A sound from inside the house. Not loud, not violent, just a soft, deliberate thud beneath the floorboards, as if the dark had been waiting for him. The air around the house felt colder than the rest of the valley, as if the land itself had stepped back to give it space. Ethan Cole stood still for a moment longer, studying the structure the way he had once studied unfamiliar terrain, careful, measured, patient. The windows were clouded with age and dust, and the wooden siding carried deep lines of weather damage that made it look older than anything else for miles. Ranger moved ahead of him without hesitation, paws pressing softly into the frozen ground, nose low and steady as he traced a slow path toward the front steps. Ethan followed, the key still in his hand, its metal colder now than it had been in the truck. Each step toward the door felt heavier, not from fear, but from the strange certainty that something inside was already aware of them. When he reached the porch, the wood creaked under his weight, and the sound echoed too long, as if the house was listening back. Ranger paused at the threshold, head slightly tilted, ears rotating as though catching a frequency just beyond human hearing. Then he let out a single low breath of sound, not a bark, not a warning, but something more like recognition. Ethan placed the key into the lock, and it turned with unexpected ease, the mechanism giving way like it had been waiting for years to be used again. The door opened slowly, releasing a faint wave of air that carried the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic beneath it. Inside, the entry hall stretched forward into dim light filtered through cracked windows, revealing a space frozen in time. Furniture stood covered in sheets, edges softened by dust, and the floorboards showed uneven wear patterns that suggested long abandonment. Yet there was something else, something subtle that Ethan could not immediately name, a sense that the emptiness was not complete. Ranger stepped inside first, moving carefully, his nails tapping lightly against the wooden floor, then stopping near the center of the room. He lowered his head and stared at a specific section of the floorboards, unmoving. Ethan followed his gaze and crouched slightly, noticing faint irregularities in the wood, subtle lines that did not match the rest of the construction. He pressed his hand gently against the surface, and for a moment, nothing happened, but then he felt it, a faint vibration, rhythmic and patient, coming from somewhere below. It was not strong, but it was deliberate, like something hidden beneath the house was still keeping time. Ranger shifted his weight and let out a soft, controlled sound again, pacing once in a small circle around the same spot before stopping precisely where the vibration felt strongest. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the room again, noticing now that the air itself seemed slightly different in this area, as if it carried a hidden depth. He knelt closer, running his fingers along the seam between two boards, realizing that one section did not sit flush with the rest. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. For a moment, he simply stayed there, listening, feeling the faint pulse through the floor, as Ranger stood perfectly still beside him, watching the same point with unwavering focus, as if both of them understood that whatever lay beneath was not accidental, and that the house had been keeping its secret far longer than anyone should have been able to forget. The longer Ethan Cole stayed still, the more the house seemed to reveal itself in quiet layers rather than sudden answers. The faint vibration beneath the floor did not stop, but it changed rhythm slightly, as if responding to their presence. He slowly shifted his weight, careful not to disturb the boards, While Ranger remained locked on the exact point, his body tense but controlled, ears rotating with precision as though mapping something invisible beneath them. Ethan leaned closer to the seam between the planks and noticed now that the wood had been intentionally altered, not by age or decay, but by design. One board carried a faint scratch line running along its edge, too straight to be natural, too precise to be accidental. He traced it with his fingertips, feeling a slight dip where the surface did not align perfectly with the rest of the floor. The realization came slowly, like a door opening in his mind before it opened in the house, that this section had been removed and replaced long ago with careful effort to make it appear untouched. Ranger let out a low breath and stepped back once, then forward again, circling the same point in a tight pattern before stopping with deliberate stillness. Ethan exhaled through his nose, glancing around the room once more, noticing how the rest of the house felt ordinary in comparison, almost staged in its abandonment, while this single area carried a different weight entirely. He pressed gently on the edge of the board, and this time it shifted slightly under pressure, producing a soft wooden creak that echoed downward instead of outward. The sound was absorbed by something below, not bouncing through the room as it should have. Ethan paused, listening carefully, and in that silence he felt it again, the subtle pulse from beneath, steady and patient, like a signal waiting for acknowledgement. He looked at Ranger, who had now gone completely still, eyes fixed and unblinking, as if waiting for permission rather than reaction. Ethan reached for the seam again, sliding his fingers along the edge until he found a small recessed notch hidden beneath a thin layer of dust. It was not a handle in the traditional sense, but a deliberate point of access, nearly invisible unless you already knew where to look. For a brief moment, he hesitated, the kind of hesitation born not from fear, but from awareness that whatever lay beneath had been preserved for a reason, and that reason was still intact. Then he applied steady pressure. The board shifted with a controlled release, not breaking or snapping, but giving way as part of a mechanism that had been waiting far too long to be used again. A faint draft rose from the opening, carrying the scent of old stone and metal that had not seen daylight in years. Ranger stepped closer immediately, lowering his head toward the gap, then letting out a quiet, focused sound that seemed less like a reaction and more like recognition. Ethan widened the opening carefully, revealing a narrow space beneath the floor that descended into shadow. A set of old steps became visible, leading downward into darkness that felt structured rather than empty. The house above remained still, but the space below carried a presence of its own, steady and contained, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment of discovery. Ethan stared into the opening for several seconds, the weight of what he was seeing settling in slowly, while Ranger stood beside him without moving, both of them now aligned on the edge of something that had been hidden beneath ordinary silence for a very long time. The moment Ethan Cole widened the opening beneath the floor, the house above seemed to settle into a deeper silence, as if acknowledging that something long hidden had finally been disturbed. He crouched at the edge of the exposed gap, one hand resting on the worn wood for balance while the other held a small flashlight from his pack. Its beam cut through the darkness below in a narrow, controlled line, revealing the top of a narrow staircase descending into what looked like carved stone rather than natural earth. The steps were old but intact, reinforced with metal edges that had resisted time. Far better than anything above. Ranger stood beside him without hesitation, nose pointed downward, inhaling slowly, as if mapping the air itself. Ethan lowered the flashlight slightly, allowing the beam to follow the staircase deeper, where the walls transitioned from rough stone into something more refined, almost intentionally constructed. The air rising from below was cooler, stable, and carried a faint metallic undertone mixed with the scent of aged paper and sealed space. It did not feel like abandonment. It felt preserved. Ethan shifted forward carefully, placing one boot onto the first step. The wood and metal combination held firm under his weight, producing a muted sound that echoed downward instead of outward, as if the structure absorbed noise rather than reflected it. Ranger followed immediately, stepping just ahead of him, moving with quiet precision down the stairs without hesitation or fear. As they descended, the temperature remained consistent, unaffected by the cold air above, and the walls began to show signs of intentional craftsmanship, with faint markings and structural lines suggesting this was never meant to be a basement in the traditional sense, but a secured chamber built with purpose. Ethan ran his free hand along the wall as they moved, feeling subtle grooves that formed a pattern too deliberate to be decorative alone. Halfway down, he paused briefly, noticing that the air pressure had changed slightly, as if they had crossed into a sealed environment that had only recently been reopened. Ranger stopped as well, glancing back at him once before continuing downward. At the base of the staircase, the space opened into a wider corridor illuminated faintly by Ethan's flashlight beam. The walls here were smoother, reinforced with metal panels that had dulled with age but remained structurally intact. Ahead, a heavy door stood partially visible, its surface plain but reinforced with a circular locking mechanism at its center. Ethan stepped off the last stair, his boots landing softly on a concrete floor that felt unnaturally solid compared to the fragile house above. The silence here was different, not empty, but contained, as if the room itself had been designed to hold sound within its boundaries. Ranger moved slightly ahead again, stopping just short of the sealed door, his posture steady and alert, eyes fixed on the center lock without shifting. Ethan approached slowly, raising the flashlight to examine the mechanism more closely. It was old, mechanical, and untouched by modern updates, suggesting it had not been opened in a very long time. Yet there were faint signs of recent disturbance around the edges, as if someone had come close to accessing it but stopped short. Ethan exhaled quietly, the realization forming that this space was not simply forgotten, but deliberately preserved. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the stillness around them, while Ranger remained perfectly still at his side, both of them facing a sealed threshold that suggested whatever lay beyond had been waiting far longer than either of them had expected. Standing in front of the sealed door, Ethan Cole felt a quiet pressure in the air that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation, as if the space itself was waiting for a decision that had been delayed for years. Ranger remained still at his side, eyes fixed on the circular locking mechanism at the center of the heavy door, his posture calm but intensely focused, as though he understood the importance of what stood beyond it. Ethan raised the flashlight again, studying the lock more closely, noticing now that it was not electronic or modern in any way, but a mechanical system built with precision and redundancy, featuring concentric rings and faint engraved markings that suggested both identification and authorization steps. His fingers hovered near the surface without touching it, tracing the edges visually until he found a small recessed alignment point on the right side of the mechanism. The design was deliberate, requiring sequence rather than force, and as he followed the pattern with his eyes, he realized the earlier disturbances around the frame were not damage but signs of partial access attempts, as if someone had once tried and stopped before completing the process. Ranger shifted slightly, letting out a soft, controlled breath, then stepped half a pace forward, placing his paw near the base of the door as if anchoring himself in place. Ethan adjusted his stance, exhaled slowly, and placed his hand on the first ring of the lock. It moved with surprising smoothness, rotating a fraction before stopping at a resistance point that required alignment. He paused, recalibrated his grip, and turned it again, this time feeling a subtle internal click echo through the metal. The sound was not loud, but it carried downward into the space beyond, absorbed rather than reflected. A second ring followed, then a third, each requiring careful adjustment, each producing the same muted confirmation as internal components engaged after years of stillness. When the final alignment settled into place, there was a brief moment of complete silence, deeper than anything Ethan had experienced since arriving at the house. Then, without warning, the mechanism released its tension, and the door unlocked with a slow, controlled shift that felt less like mechanical failure and more like permission granted. The heavy door opened inward just enough to reveal a thin line of dim light spilling from within, faint and steady, as though powered by a source that had never fully gone out. Ethan and Ranger stepped forward together, the flashlight beam merging with the interior glow as the room beyond came into partial view. It was not empty. The space revealed itself as a structured archive chamber, lined with metal shelving units that held sealed containers, labeled folders, and carefully arranged storage cases that appeared untouched by time. Along the far wall, A long table supported stacks of documents bound in aged material, each marked with identifiers that suggested cataloging rather than random storage. In the center of the room stood a reinforced pedestal with a single locked case resting on top, larger and more secured than anything else in the chamber. The air was still and balanced, carrying the faint scent of preserved paper and sealed metal, suggesting controlled conditions maintained long before modern systems. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, boots contacting a surface that echoed faintly but remained stable, while Ranger moved ahead with quiet certainty, circling once before returning to the center of the room, where he stopped and looked up at Ethan with steady focus. It was in that moment Ethan realized this was not simply storage, but a deliberately constructed vault designed to protect something intended to remain hidden until the right person arrived. And as he scanned the rows of sealed materials stretching into the dim light, he understood that whatever truth had been buried here was still intact, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Inside the archive chamber, Ethan Cole stood motionless for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the steady, controlled lighting that seemed engineered to preserve rather than illuminate. The air carried a quiet weight, not heavy or oppressive, but intentional, as if every object in the room had been placed with purpose and never disturbed since. Ranger moved slowly between the shelves, his steps careful and deliberate, pausing at intervals to sniff the edges of sealed containers without touching them, as though recognizing boundaries that should not be crossed. Ethan walked toward the nearest shelving unit, running his flashlight along the labels, each one marked with dates spanning decades, all organized in a system that suggested long-term preservation rather than temporary storage. The consistency of it unsettled him more than disorder would have. Everything here had been maintained. Everything had been remembered. He reached out and carefully pulled a single folder from the shelf, its edges stiff with age but intact, and opened it slowly. Inside were documents written in clean, precise handwriting and typed reports stamped with institutional markings that no longer matched any modern system he recognized. Names appeared repeatedly across different pages, forming patterns that suggested continuity across time, not coincidence. Ethan felt a subtle shift in his focus as he realized these were not random records, but part of a structured archive tied to ownership, transfers, and sealed holdings that had never been publicly recorded. Ranger let out a soft, steady sound from across the room, drawing Ethan's attention toward the central pedestal. The locked case at its center seemed unchanged, but now it carried a different presence, as if its importance had grown simply by being acknowledged. Ethan returned the folder carefully and moved toward the pedestal, his steps slow and measured. The case was reinforced, its surface smooth except for a single identification plate that bore no name, only a coded sequence of letters and numbers. He studied it for a long moment, then shifted his attention back to the surrounding documents, searching for anything that matched the code. After several minutes, he found a reference buried within a transfer ledger, linking the code to a private trust structure established decades earlier, designed specifically to remain hidden from public registries. His breath slowed as he traced the connections, realizing the scope of what he was standing inside was far greater than a single property or inheritance. This was a containment system for something deliberately protected across generations. Ranger stepped closer to the pedestal, placing himself directly beside Ethan, his gaze fixed on the locked case without distraction. Ethan placed his hand lightly on the surface of the case, feeling a faint vibration similar to what he had sensed above the floor, subtle but persistent, as if whatever was inside still maintained its own rhythm. He did not attempt to open it immediately. Instead, he studied the locking interface, noticing it required a secondary access sequence tied to physical documents rather than force or tools. Returning to the shelf, he carefully reviewed more files until he discovered a sealed envelope marked with the same code as the case. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper containing a short directive written in formal language, instructing that the contents of the vault were to remain sealed until physically claimed by the designated successor. Ethan paused as the meaning settled in, realizing that his presence here was not accidental, nor was the inheritance of the ruined house itself. Ranger let out a low, controlled breath and sat down beside him, as if confirming what Ethan had already begun to understand, that the chamber, the documents, and the sealed case were all connected to him in ways he had not yet fully uncovered, and that the next step would determine not only what was hidden inside, but why he had been chosen to find it at all. The chamber felt different after Ethan Cole read the sealed directive, as if the words on the page had quietly changed the weight of the entire space around him. He stood still for several seconds, holding the paper carefully between his fingers, while Ranger remained seated beside the pedestal, unmoving, eyes fixed on the locked case with an intensity that suggested understanding rather than curiosity. Ethan slowly returned the document to its envelope, placing it back exactly where he found it, then turned his attention once more to the sealed case at the center of the room. The identification code on its surface no longer felt like random marking, but like a key waiting for its corresponding memory. He exhaled slowly and reached into the folder again, scanning the remaining documents with greater focus. This time he noticed a pattern he had missed before, repeated references to a transfer authorization protocol that required presence-based validation rather than written permission. It was not enough to inherit the property. The system required acknowledgement from the designated successor in person, as if the vault itself had been designed to confirm identity through intent rather than paperwork. Ethan stepped closer to the case, studying its surface carefully. Subtle grooves traced around the locking interface, forming a sequence that matched entries he had just read. He placed his hand near the first alignment point and hesitated, feeling the faint vibration beneath his palm grow slightly stronger than before. It was not mechanical noise, but a steady internal pulse, as if something inside the case was still active in a controlled state of waiting. Ranger shifted his position, moving from a seated posture to standing beside Ethan again, pressing slightly closer without contact, his presence steady and grounding. Ethan adjusted his stance and began the sequence described in the documents, rotating the first ring of the lock with slow precision. It resisted briefly, then responded with a soft internal click. The second ring followed, requiring more deliberate alignment, and as it turned, the vibration in the room subtly changed frequency, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. Each adjustment felt less like unlocking and more like synchronizing with something already in motion. When he reached the final ring, Ethan paused again, his hand resting lightly on the mechanism. The silence in the chamber deepened, and even Ranger seemed to hold still in anticipation. Ethan completed the final rotation. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the locking system released with a controlled internal shift, and the case emitted a faint mechanical exhale, as if decompressing after decades of sealed containment. The lid did not open immediately. Instead, a narrow seam of light appeared along its edge, soft and steady, illuminating the surrounding metal with a faint glow that had not come from any external source. Ethan stepped back slightly, watching as the case unlocked its secondary seal and slowly lifted upward with deliberate, hydraulic precision. Inside, the contents were not what he had expected. There were no obvious valuables or documents of immediate financial value, only a carefully arranged set of compact storage units, each labeled with codes matching those in the archive. At the center lay a single structured device connected to a control interface, still faintly powered, its surface displaying minimal indicators of active preservation status. Ranger let out a quiet, controlled sound, then stepped forward one pace before stopping again, as if recognizing that the threshold of discovery had been crossed but not yet fully understood. Ethan remained still, processing the realization that the vault was not a hidden treasure in the traditional sense, but a controlled system built to preserve something far more deliberate, and that whatever purpose it served had remained intact, waiting for him not only to find it, but to decide what would happen next. The moment Ethan Cole fully revealed the sealed case, the chamber seemed to settle into a deeper kind of stillness, as if the entire space had been holding its breath for far longer than he had realized. The soft internal glow from the opened container illuminated the room with a steady, controlled light that did not flicker or shift, suggesting an independent system still operating after years without interruption. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes moving between the structured storage units and the central device connected to the interface, carefully observing the subtle indicators that remained active. Ranger stayed near his side, no longer circling or scanning, but standing with quiet focus, his gaze locked on the device as though recognizing something familiar beneath its surface. Ethan slowly reached toward the interface panel, noting that it responded to proximity rather than pressure, activating faintly as his hand came within a few inches. A series of low, steady lights appeared along the edges of the device, forming a sequence that matched patterns he had already seen in the archive documents. It was not random activation, but structured recognition, confirming alignment between the system and its designated user. As he hesitated, a soft mechanical tone emerged from within the chamber, not an alarm, but a confirmation signal, calm and deliberate, followed by a faint projection of light across the inner wall of the vault. Lines of data began to appear, forming a structured map combined with coded references to locations far beyond the property itself. Ethan's eyes widened slightly as he followed the projections, realizing the system was not limited to this chamber, but connected to a broader network of secured points, each marked with the same classification code found on the case. Ranger shifted his stance slightly, moving closer to Ethan, then pausing as the projection changed again, revealing a final layer of information. At the center of the display, a single designation appeared, tied directly to Ethan's name in a formal succession format, confirming him not merely as an inheritor of property, but as an authorized recipient of a long-standing custodial system. The realization settled in slowly, reshaping everything he had understood since receiving the first letter. The ruin above was not the end of ownership, but a threshold. The vault was not a discovery, but a confirmation. Ethan lowered his hand slightly, watching as the device completed its recognition cycle and the chamber lights stabilized into a consistent glow. Ranger let out a quiet breath and remained still, as if acknowledging the final alignment of something long predetermined. Ethan turned his attention back to the storage units, understanding now that each container represented not isolated valuables, but fragments of a larger structure of preserved knowledge and intent. The chamber around him no longer felt like a hidden room beneath an abandoned house, but like a central node in a system that had been waiting for continuity. For the first time since arriving, Ethan understood that the inheritance was not about wealth or property alone, but about responsibility to something carefully maintained across time, and that whatever lay beyond this vault would require him to decide not just what was hidden, but what would continue. For several moments after the system stabilized, Ethan Cole remained still, letting the reality of what he was seeing fully settle in. The chamber was no longer reacting to his presence, but instead maintaining a steady operational state, as if it had completed a long-delayed verification cycle. The soft illumination from the central device continued to project structured data onto the surrounding walls, but the intensity had lowered into a calm, readable glow. Ranger stood beside him without movement, his attention no longer shifting between objects, but fixed on Ethan himself, as if awaiting a decision rather than reacting to discovery. Ethan slowly turned his gaze across the chamber, taking in the full scale of what had been revealed. The storage units, the sealed archives, and the central interface were not isolated elements, but parts of a coordinated system designed with long-term continuity in mind. Each label, each coded sequence, each structural alignment pointed toward a single purpose: preservation of controlled information across generations without degradation or external interference. He stepped closer to one of the storage units and carefully opened a secondary panel. Inside were compact data capsules, each stored in protective casing and arranged in precise order. The markings on them corresponded to multiple categories he had seen earlier, but now he understood they were not random classifications. They were layers of access, each requiring specific authorization levels tied directly to identity confirmation. Ranger moved slightly, following Ethan's motion, then stopped again as Ethan placed one capsule onto the reading interface. The system responded immediately, projecting a new set of structured records that expanded beyond the chamber walls into a broader mapped network. Ethan studied the projection carefully, realizing that the vault beneath the house was not an endpoint, but a central node connected to multiple secured locations across different regions. Each node carried the same classification signature, suggesting a coordinated system that had been operating silently in parallel for decades. As he absorbed this, a new sequence appeared within the projection, highlighting a final directive layer. It was not technical data, but a formal message embedded within the system's architecture. The message confirmed that the continuity of the entire network now depended on the recognized successor present within the chamber. Ethan felt a subtle shift in his understanding, not of ownership, but of responsibility. Ranger stepped closer again, this time pressing lightly against Ethan's side, a quiet, grounding presence that broke the intensity of the moment without disrupting it. Ethan looked down at him briefly, then returned his attention to the projection as it shifted once more, revealing a final structural map of all connected vaults and their active status indicators. For the first time, he understood the full scale of what had been inherited. It was not a single hidden chamber beneath an abandoned house, but a preserved system designed to protect knowledge, assets, and directives that had been deliberately safeguarded against time itself. The ruin above was only a cover, the vault below only one layer, and beyond it stretched a network still quietly active, waiting for continuity to be maintained. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, feeling the weight of the realization settle not as shock, but as clarity. The system had not simply been discovered. It had been handed over. And in that quiet, controlled chamber beneath the forgotten house, Ethan Cole understood that whatever came next would depend entirely on how he chose to carry forward something that had already been waiting far longer than he had been alive.